Hi, welcome back. In the last part we looked at laying our UVs out in 3 separate UV patches. So I've had a little reorganization. We've got basically the horns over here. Here is all the skin, and here is some sundriest things like the gums and the eyes and whatnot. Now, before we go any further, it should be noted that these can be organized a little better. Your goal here is to fill in all of the space possible with your UV. So for instance, this could be resized a little bit just to make it bigger, so we use more of the available space. The more available space you actually use, the better quality your texture will be, because if this was a 1K texture, then obviously the bigger this is, the more room I'm going to get to paint. So what you don't want is a lot of empty space. Now, I'm not going to take too long here on camera organizing this and rescaling and moving it about, but you should be aware that the less empty space you have within each of these patches, the better off that you're going to be. But for right now, this will do for our sort of intent and purposes. Okay, now there are a couple of other changes I need to make. When we combined this, we combined the outer eye as well, and we don't actually need it. We won't be painting that in Mari. That will simply be a transparent glossy material. So we're going to have to fix that. I'm just going to go mesh separate. I'm going to select the outer eye portion and hide it, and I'm going to do the same around here. Just going to take this outer eye portion, hide it, then I'm going to select the whole dinosaur again and recombine it. So mesh combine. Okay, so I don't want to take anything with me, and I'm going to just get rid of the history on that before I export it. I don't want to take anything with me that I'm not painting. This will be the export for Mari. So as we weren't going to paint those outer eye surfaces, we don't really want them cluttering up the issue, and that would go for anything else that we weren't going to paint within Mari or ZBrush or wherever we're going to export this guy out to, in our case Mari. You don't really want any sundriest details cluttering up the place. So if we look at our UV map again, you'll see it's basically the same, just the 2 square UV tiles we had for the outer eye are gone. So it's no real problem for us. We've still got everything that we need to paint on. Okay, so the other thing is I'm using here the smooth mesh preview, so I get a nice smooth dinosaur, and this is how he's going to be finally posed and animated and everything else. So when I export this guy to Mari, I actually want to export a smooth version so I can paint a smooth high resolution mesh. Now unfortunately Mari won't obey the smoothing that's used within Maya, so we'll need to just go up and go mesh smooth, just so when I export a nice smooth version of this mesh. So before we export, we're going to do an OBJ, so we'll need to go down and make sure we have OBJ export ticked here, and then we'll just export this character. So export selection, and I've got one here that I've done earlier. I'm just going to call him Bert for Mari and export. There we go. So now I have this ready to go in Mari. Now for me, I'm going to paint some of the textures within Photoshop, some of the base textures. Now as we're going to do a sort of a cartoon lizard skin, you could go onto Google of course, or whatever your favorite texture place is, and download the textures for it. But I prefer in this case, because it's a little cartoony, to hand paint. And things like eyes, when you download textures for these on from the internet, a lot of the time they'll have the specular highlights built in, and we really don't want any of that. We're going to generate all that in 3D. So I'm going to paint the eye and the skin base textures within Photoshop. Okay, so I'll pop open Photoshop here, and we're going to start with fairly decent sized texture. So we'll do our 1K eyeball, so just 1024 by 1024, and this will give us a base to paint on. Now I'm going to double click there just to take the background layer off because it's not necessary, and I'm going to start out by drawing the main round shape for the eye, and I can do this with just a paintbrush. So let's go up, and we know this is 1K, so let's start off around 750. Actually much easier just to type that in. So around 750 pixels with maximum hardness, and I'm going to use black, although I don't really like to use a solid black, more of a very dark grey. Let's just get that somewhat in the middle and plonk that down. Now that will form the basis of our eye, but it doesn't look kind of very 3D, so in order to change that, we'll come up, set the brush hardness to 0, keep the size the same, flick this over to white, and again I don't want a pure white, just slightly off white, and then I'm going to come in and put this in the center and click once, and you'll get this sort of 3D graduated effect, making the whole thing look a little less flat. So this will be the basis of our eye. Now we need some color for our eye, so I'm going to create a new layer to put the color on. I'm going to use the brush, I'm going to come up, and I'm going to go around 400, 380, maybe something like that, and this will form the main color portion of the eye. So let's get a hardness of 100%, and let's get a color we like. Now for me, you can use this to create human eyes, but for me, I'm going to go for a sort of goldy color. It's more in keeping with our cartoon character, and I'm going to want this to be 100% hardness. I'm going to get it in the middle of this thing and just click, and that will form the main color basis for our eye there. So again, this is looking very, very flat, and it's a bit sharp, so we could have used a softer brush, but we can also just blur. So let's get a Gaussian blur, radius of about 7 pixels, depending on how blurry you want that, but around 7 for me is fine. So I'm going to click OK, and we're starting to get the eye shape up. This is the white of the eye, and this is obviously the start of the coloured portion. But it's very flat still, even though it's blurred in, so we need a big highlight in the middle just to give us some sort of contrast here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to use a much lighter version of the colour that I just used for this. So somewhere around there, I'm going to take the brush and I'm going to make this about half size, so maybe 150. There we go. And I'm going to use a very, very soft brush, maybe around 10%. And I'm just going to dot a highlight of color in the middle there. Now we've got this highlight of color, we're going to need to, in fact, I think I might actually use a slightly bigger brush, get a slightly bigger highlight. Again, this can be a bit fiddly, might need to play around with it until you get the results you want. But I'm just going to do, there we go. So I've got a big highlight in the center of the eye now. Now I want to smudge it outwards, so I'm going to use the smudge tool to smudge this out and create some streaks. So let's switch to the smudge tool. There we go, and the settings I want for this are a size of 1, a hardness of around 50%, and also I don't need that much strength, so strength of around 50%. And then I'm going to take this and start by smudging downwards. Okay, and we don't seem to be smudging a lot here. Let me just find out why. That should be smudging much more. We should increase the size of this brush, probably a little low there at 1 pixel. Let's try 15, and there we get a nice smudge, but it's too much. So let's try a strength of maybe 25. And now we can create some smudges. So basically you want to come out here and just go radially downwards to create a sort of starburst pattern. And you're going to want to just keep working at this until you get a nice smudged starburst. So as you can see, I'm just doing the bottom half of the eye here. And I'm doing it fairly quickly. You might want to take a bit more time. I'm also using a tablet to do this, but you can do it with a mouse. It's not a problem. Just come in and get that nice and smudged out in this kind of starbursty way. And this is just one of those things, with painting in real life, with painting in Photoshop. It can just be a case of it can take some time. You might need to come back to it, but just get something you're happy with. For now, this will be about right. I might actually hit Control T to resize this layer somewhat and get my highlight a bit bigger there. Okay. So that should do it. We can come back and adjust the size of this later on, of course. And I'm really not happy with the smudging up here, so it's just a bit more smudginess. And again, I'm not going to spend too long on this. I mean, it's not so interesting to watch somebody sit there and paint. I'm going to change the layer mode though to overlay, probably. Let's have a look. Overlay, where have you got to? There we go. And that's a bit dark. So let's see if I can get one I like. Screen is fine. We'll come back to it and look at it in a minute. Right now let's just put a pupil in so we can get a look at what that's like. Let's just come here and we want to go black, but again not 100% black, just slightly off. And let's get a brush for pupil size. So we know we want our pupil to be around maybe 100, no, that's going to be a bit small, maybe 200. Okay, that might be a bit large, depending on how much colour you want in your eye. We want quite a large pupil for this character though, so we'll go with a fairly hard brush. Let's just try that. And let's see, we're on the smudge tool. My apologies. So there we go. Now I should just be able to drop a pupil in there. Okay, that gives us a pupil, and now we need to do some lines around the eye. Now we'll blur in this pupil a bit as well, so fill up blur, Gaussian blur again, and that will just blur in the pupil. Maybe a little bit less blur than we used on the main one. There we go. Okay, so this has given us a basis for our eye that's shaping up quite nicely, and because these are on separate layers you can obviously move them to get them into the correct position. If you've been a bit like me and been a bit inaccurate with a paintbrush, when you dotted the pupil in, you can just always pick it up and move it. And now we need to create some sort of tonal definition within this eye. So to do that I'm going to use a paintbrush with a size of 1 and a hardness of around 50%. Actually, it doesn't really matter with the hardness and the size, but the opacity, that's important. So let's get the opacity about 46%. And now I'm just going to add a new layer and draw a series of radiating strokes outwards. So this is probably easier if I just draw them. So I'm going to start here, and that's black. We want white. This is going to create the definition around the coloured part of the eye. So I'm just going to draw these lines in, and I want these to go all the way around the eye, so I'm going to draw in markers here, here and here. So I want them to radiate. And again, you know, I'm being a bit sloppy here, so you might want to take some more time, but it seriously is just a series of these wavy lines coming outwards. And there are a variety of techniques for doing this, but I quite like this one. It's nice and simple, and it does produce a good result. It produces a better result if you take more time and effort getting this nicely lined up, but I don't want to bore you all to tears, so I'm just going to do this pretty quickly. Okay, here we go, almost done, and we're going to have to draw more of these lines unfortunately, but as I said, it's one of those things when you're painting, sometimes it just takes a bit of time. And this technique would allow us to get eyeballs that are you know, more cat-shaped or more funky alien shaped. They don't have to be round. You can do them any shape you want. So we've got the first set of radiating lines out here. Now for the second set of lines, and this is terrible here, let's just change that a bit. For the second set of lines, we're just, whoops, we're just going to go like so and draw around in a sort of wavy line circular pattern. And again, off camera I would be much more accurate about this with the spacing and everything, but for on camera this should be definitely good enough to demonstrate the technique, I hope. So just some lines around there, and a final set of lines we'll want to do some kind of loop-de-loops. Again, all this is easier with a tablet, but you know, I've done this with a mouse many times. It's not so bad. And as you can see, I'm being quite messy about the placement, which again would take more time and effort on this for the final thing. But this is the basic technique. Now we're going to need to blur this out so it looks much more like an eyeball. Okay, so make sure we have the right layer selected, which of course we would, and let's go to Filter, Blur, and let's do a radial blur on Zoom method, and amount, let's try 8 to start with. Okay, so that's kind of blurred us out a little bit, but I think we should probably use a little bit more blur on that. So let's just go back to the blur, let's see, radial blur, and again it can be a bit of a trial and error situation. Let's zoom, let's put the quality on best, and let's put the amount at, say, almost double that, and let's click OK. Alright, that's given us a much better look, but it's still not perfect, so let's duplicate this layer here. And that's kind of highlighted it a bit, and then let's just blur this layer. Here we go, so let's just do a Gaussian blur this time and blur it a bit less. Okay, and I'll turn the opacity of that down just a little bit. Okay, so we need some definition around this eyeball, and there's a few tweaks to do, but what's missing from this really is the specular highlights in the center of the eye here and along the edge. Now for us this isn't a problem because those specular highlights will be generated by our 3D program, so when we have the shiny outer eye exterior on there we'll be able to do that. And also this is not really big enough, now I see it all together, but the nice thing about having this all on layers is we can now just make it a bit bigger. Okay, so, and also if you wanted this, say, cat shaped, you can come in and get it, you know, whatever shape you want it, which is one of the benefits of doing it yourself rather than, you know, borrowing somebody's texture off the internet. So let me just, don't apply that. Now I've reshaped it, and let's just try this again, just making this a little bit larger. Okay, there we go. Now let's put some definition around here, so the color of the eye is sort of much more defined from the background. So we'll select our main color here, which is here, and we'll just add maybe a inner shadow to it. So let's have a look, inner shadow, there we go, and that puts the defining strokes around there. Now let's see if we can adjust this a bit. So let's give it a size, maybe, size variant, there we go, the distance, and let's see, opacity up a little bit maybe. Okay, let's actually put the distance down to 0, and let's put the size up. There we go, because we don't, if we have the distance we'll get this sort of shadowing up here and not down here. We want a overall blending. Okay, and then it's just a case to fiddle with the size to get something you're happy with. And I'm kind of happy around there. Okay, there we go. So that will be the eyeball that we actually use for our character. Now from here, if you wanted to change the color of the eye, if you wanted to make it more human or blue or green or red, you can do this. If you go to Control and U while you're on the layer for color, you can actually hit colorize and use the hue slider to change the color of the eye. Now obviously you would need to do the same hue for the highlight. So let's say we wanted a green style of eye. I can come in here and go OK, then I can come up to the highlight, Control U, same thing, and I'll just make sure that this is a green highlight. So around the same place, around 170 I think we were, and now I have a green eye. Obviously I can change the lightness of this, and the same with this. So if I just wanted to lighten it up a bit and deepen its saturation, there we get a nice light green eye. So really once you've got this base, and you know, you might want to spend a few more minutes doing the lines, because you know, the better you make those lines, the more accurate, the more of them you have, you can get a much better effect than we have here. But for a basic eye painting, I'm actually quite happy with this one. This will work just fine for our character. So I'm going to now design some lizard skin, and as we're going to do sort of a cartoon lizard, I'm just going to make my own texture. Now this one will be 4K, so 4096 by 4096, and as we're painting it itself, we might as well have a big texture. Now I need a cartoon lizard skin. The color, to be brutally honest, is not terribly important at the moment, because we'll be able to hue shift this whenever we want to. So get a color that you're kind of happy with. Now I might do mine in a blue, and then we're going to go up to filters, and we're just going to come to texture. So let's find let's say oil paint, and this should open up the texturizer. It doesn't. Filter gallery, there you go. And we'll go for a stained glass. So at the moment I've got this, which is kind of nice. It's alright, but it's not perfect. This is not really going to work. So let's change the base color of our image. So that will be the base color, and then we'll have a lighter color to define in between. In fact, let's start out with the lighter base color. It will be easier to hue shift later on. So a less saturated base color. Okay, and then filter. Texturizer, where are you? Filter gallery. And what we've got here is some stained glass, as you can see. Let me just zoom this out so you can see it. Okay, and that's going to be like this. I'm going to change the cell size, so I might have them bigger. This is obviously taking a while to calculate because of the 4K imageness. So let's come up, get that a bit bigger, maybe even a bit bigger. And the light intensity I might turn down a bit. Actually, I might have to turn that up a bit. And I'm going to make the borders slightly thicker, so we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. Okay, and now I'm going to hit OK, and this will be the texture for my lizard skin. So I'm going to actually cut it out in the middle. I don't need all this blue surround. I'm just going to crop that down, and that will be the texture that I use to paint the cartoon lizard skin. Now I'm not going to blur this as well, so let's do a filter blur, Gaussian blur, and because I don't want this particularly sharp, and that will be the texture, or at least the basis of the texture that we use to paint our lizard skin. Now you might change the color and tweak it a little bit, and depending on what color you want your final lizard to be, you might change this in Photoshop. In fact, I'll load in one I made earlier, as they say, and you can just see the difference. So here is the one I just made, and here is the one I actually used to paint the final thing. So they're pretty similar. This one is a little lighter and this one is a little darker, but really your mileage may vary on the size you want, because these will eventually become lizard skin scales, so you might want a different size. Because it's a 4K image though, we've got a fairly decent level of zoom. This image is now at 100%, so we're actually quite a big image. And as I say, here's the one I originally created, which probably has a little bit less blur on it now I look at it. So again, you can use this to create any sort of size lizard scales, lizard skin that you want. So now we have an eye, and we have the basis for our skin texture. So that's it for this part. I hope you found something that's useful to you in here, and in the next part we're going to go into Mari and start actually painting this beastie up. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next part. Cheers.